Welcome to another episode of Rooted and Built. And what I did not realize for last episode was that was the 10th episode, making this episode number 11. So if you have stuck with us through 10 episodes and now the 11th one, thank you for being a supportive viewer and hopefully starting some discussion with us as we talk about the reliability of the Bible. So last week we discussed some different points of reliability that historians make towards ancient texts, and we saw that the Bible hits all of those points and even surpasses some of the ancient texts who no one questions the authenticity of them, the writers who wrote them, no one questions that. So we saw that when it comes to the Bible being a reliable historical document that was written and preserved over thousands of years, it hits all of those points. We also talked a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls and about how they were found between a span of 1947 through 1956, where some shepherds saw them in some caves off the coast of the Dead Sea. So we got to discuss a little bit about how these scrolls and how far they date. It's just a miracle that they were preserved in the way that they were, because they are now some of the oldest manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament. In fact, there was 970 different manuscripts found, some of them partial, some of them full, of the Old Testament. So it just proves to us that the Old Testament was preserved. Actually, it confirmed that the manuscripts that we had are preserved well throughout the years. It confirmed that when we found those Dead Sea Scrolls, and it gave us some different commentaries that were written by Jewish scholars of the day and their notes and commentaries on the Old Testament writing. So that was pretty cool to see that. Again, if you do not know much about the Dead Sea Scrolls, I highly encourage you to look it up and look at the pictures. The pictures will just make your jaw drop about the preservation of these Old Testament scrolls and just how readable they are as well. Even without the technology that we have today, you can still see the lettering that they was written in Hebrew. It's amazing. So go look up the Dead Sea Scrolls and look at some of these manuscripts, some of the partial pieces that we have of these manuscripts. We also talked about how during the time in which the gospel writers were writing about Jesus, there were other writers writing things about political leaders and emperors as well. So we said that one of the reasons that the gospel writers did not write right after Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended is because, for one, they thought Jesus was coming back again in their lifetime. And for two, this habit of writing about leaders and writing about different things did not happen until later on in the 50s, maybe even 60s, in which people started to write about different political leaders and different happenings of the world in the same sense of how the Gospels were written. And then we talked about some extra biblical resources and writers who poured into the knowledge that we have of the Judean Roman era. And one of those that we talked about, I mentioned him briefly, is Josephus. His name is actually Flavius Josephus, and that's not his given name or his name that he had when he was born, because he was a Jew. So he had a Hebrew name, and I won't even try because I'll butcher it really bad. But he changed his name to Flavius Josephus, which is more of a Roman name, when he became a Roman citizen, much to the disgruntlement of his fellow Jews. But this volume that I have with me today is a English translation of his writing. So Josephus was not a Christian. He was, like I said, born a Jew. He was actually born into a priestly family. He was born into an aristocratic family, so his family had money and they had connections. And he was born in the year 37, which means he was born right after, just a couple of years after Jesus died, was resurrected, and ascended, meaning he grew up in the era of the rise of Christianity. He grew up in a time where there was religious turmoil happening because the Jews were against these Christian Jews who were proclaiming Christ as the Messiah, and the Gentiles who Jesus would bring into the fold, and Paul Paul and his preaching to the Gentiles would bring into the fold. So he grew up in this time of religious turmoil. But also during this time, it was a fighting amongst the Jews and the Romans. So there was several Jewish zealots who rose up against Rome and wanted to overthrow them. When Jesus did not do that, several people decided that they would decide to revolt against Rome. Also, in the time of Jesus, there was these zealots who would be against the Roman rule. There's several Jews that just did as they were told, but there were many who did not. Flavius Josephus became one of those Jewish zealots who was against Rome. In fact, he was the commander of a Jewish Galilean army that revolted against the Roman government. And when all of the things happened with Jerusalem, Jesus predicted that the temple in Jerusalem would fall and that the Jerusalem would be overrun by Rome. And more so than it was in the time of Jesus. And that is exactly what happened. In 70 AD, there was the complete fall of Jerusalem, and Flavius Josephus was a part of that. And after that, there was this battle, actually a little bit before that, there was this battle in which Josephus was captured by the Romans. And so when Josephus was captured by the Romans, he realized that Rome was too powerful and there was no beating the Roman government. So he started to say that the Jews need to back off. And he started to become an informant to the Romans about the Jews, which turned his fellow Jews against him. He basically was a turncoat and turned his back on his people to be an informant to the Romans. And at that point, he decided to settle in Rome. He moved to Rome and then take on this Roman name of Flavius Josephus. And it's at this point, around the late 80s, early 90s, when Josephus started to write. And man, did he write. This is not even everything that he wrote. He wrote many volumes, some of which we do not have. We know that they exist because he mentions them in the writings we do have. But he writes many things about the Jewish-Roman War. He writes about the Jewish culture and history. Is called Jewish Antiquities. He writes about his own life. He does an autobiography, and he writes about a response that him and a contemporary that he disagreed with were having some disagreements about various things. So he writes a argument against him, and it's included in his work. So we have this. Also, Josephus's native language was Hebrew Aramaic. But he writes, and during his life, mastered the Greek language enough to write in Greek. So many of his writings are written originally in Greek and then translated into Hebrew. Several of them are written in Aramaic, a few of them in Hebrew. But it's fascinating that he would attempt to write in Greek instead of his native language. It has also been said because of that, he used several people who were fluent in Greek to help him write these things. And the reason why we're talking so much about Josephus is, one, he lived in the time in which the Gospels were being written. He lived in the time in which Paul was writing his letters to the churches, and he lived and experienced the Jewish-Roman wars, and he mentions Jesus. Again, Josephus was not a Christian. He was Jewish through and through, except for when he's helping the Romans. But he is an extra-biblical writer who mentions Jesus without ever actually believing that Jesus was the Messiah. But something that Josephus writes about, in a little paragraph in Book 18, mentions Jesus in such a way that causes many historians to disagree whether Josephus actually wrote this or a copyist who happened to be Christian inserted it as an interpolation. So that's something we're going to talk about next episode, because it's really fascinating, because it shows, if it is true that Josephus wrote this, it shows that he knew about the message of the gospel, and it also shows and gives some validity to the fact that Jesus existed, that he performed miracles, that he died, and that his believers, his followers, believed that he rose from the dead. So this is a resource outside of the Bible, outside of of those who follow Jesus, who was not a Christian, writing about Jesus, which makes it incredibly exciting when we read and study all the things that Josephus wrote and the parallels that it has to the Bible in the times in which the New Testament was written. It makes it extremely exciting to have this resource and that he would write in such a way that we can say, at least from Josephus's non-believer point of view, the Bible that we have from the New Testament is a legitimate writing. In the future of this series that we're going through in the reliability of the Bible, we're going to talk about whether the Bible is actually scripture inspired by God or not. But for now, what we're trying to wrap our heads around and trying to produce an argument for is that is the Bible a reliable source from those who believe that it is true? Can we rely on the fact that this was copied years after years after years and preserved? And as we saw in the previous episode, episode 10, and as we have seen through Josephus and the things that he says in his writings, this is a large volume, let me give you a summary. He solidifies many of the things that were written in the Old Testament and the culture in the New Testament. All that we know about Judean Roman culture in the day and the things that were happening in the Roman government, the things that were happening in society, and the temperament of those Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. We have all of those things in these volumes, in these works from Josephus. So we can use these extra biblical resources such as his volumes to solidify the fact for us that the Bible is at least a reliable historical document that has been preserved for thousands of years. But we are going to deal in the next episode of this little passage that is written in Josephus' works. We're not going to do it in this episode because there's a lot of points of historical points and disagreements between historians about it. So we're going to use a whole episode to talk about those points next time that we meet together, which I'm super excited about if you cannot tell, because Josephus, again, is a highly reliable resource that we have that confirms many of the things that are actually in Scripture. So make sure you tune in next time. Also, in between now and next week, make sure you've watched all the other episodes where we have talked about the existence of God, dealt with the problem of evil. If you've missed any of that, I highly encourage you to go back and watch those things as we push forward in our discussion about the reliability of the Bible. Can we trust it as being preserved for thousands of years? And yes, we can. Based off of historical reliabilities and extra biblical resources that we have, we can know that the Bible is at least reliable as historical copies from the writers who have written it down for us. So make sure that you are subscribed. So if you have not subscribed to this podcast particularly or to our channel overall, make sure you are subscribed so that you will get notifications every time we drop a new episode on this podcast or Pastor Matt's podcast as well. And also, comment. We want to see your comments on the different videos so that we're able to have a discussion and less of a monologue. So comment. We want to see your comments on all of our videos. Comment if you know anything about Josephus. Comment if you know something about the Dead Sea Scrolls that would be beneficial for everybody. Comment about your favorite translation of the Bible, as in the next few episodes we are going to be discussing that and in detail. Which ones are the best? Which ones are not so good, and things like that. So we would love to see your comments on all these videos and like and share to people that you know as well. Thank you for joining this one. Make sure you tune in next week for episode 12.